Welcome to the letter P, as in pioneers, as in Genoni, Fortuny, Gallenga, and Thayaht. So, what happened before the 1950s, before the official birth of Italian fashion? As you probably remember from our previous talk, during the first decades of the 20th century, dressing à la Parisienne was a must for the stylish Italian women, and French fashion was widely copied by local dressmakers. But despite this conformity, four designers independently operating in different cities began to define a style free from foreign diktats. So let's see who they are and in which cities they worked. The first one is Rosa Genoni, active in Milan at the beginning of the 20th century. At this time, Milan was the most modern city in northern Italy, renowned for La Scala Opera House and its cultural and political life. From a fashion point of view, the opening in 1877 of the very first Italian department store modeled on Parisian's Bon Marché inaugurated a fashion innovation. Built next to the Duomo, it was renamed Aux Villes d'Italie and then became Alle Città d'Italia, and 30 years later he was eventually renamed La Rinascente by the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. Milan was also the city where the most influential women magazines were published, and again it was Milan the battlefield of the first socialist upheavals. This is the context where we have to picture a Rosa Genoni, a self-made woman from Sondrio, who soon became a successful designer, a political activist, and a proto-feminist. She was also called, back in 1907, the inventor of Italian fashion by the most influential newspapers of the time, Corriere della Sera. After a stint in Paris, Genoni worked as a seamstress in Milan, and in 1904, she's a premier at Hearts and Fields, a Milanese house specialized in reproducing Parisian clothes. A few steps from La Rinascente department store, Hearts and Fields was renowned for the impeccable and à la mode tailoring and having ateliers in the chicest seaside and mountain resorts such as Sanremo and St. Moritz. Genoni, thanks to her Parisian apprenticeship, had learned marketing strategy and the value of individualistic vision. Fashion, she strongly believed, could be a pivotal way to forge a national identity. At the same time, Genoni's sensibility was completely Italian. She loved looking back for inspiration to our artistic heritage, and her 6 revolutionary dresses, inspired by Renaissance painters, were awarded the International Jury Grand Prix at the 1906 Milan Expo Fair. Among them, we must recall the court mantle inspired by the drawings of the Renaissance artist Pisanello, and the celebrated dress inspired by Botticelli's Primavera, both of them kept in the Costume Gallery in Florence. Genoni also revolutionized the clothing decoration, introducing 3-dimensional naturalistic embroidery never experimented in fashion before. Genoni's radical creations were promoted by political activists such as Anna Kulishov, one of the founders of the Italian Socialist Party, and by celebrities such as Lida Borelli, a silent movie star and dedicated follower of fashion, a sort of grandmother of the stars like Kate Blanchett and Nicole Kidman. It was indeed Lida Borelli who launched in 1906 the famous Genoni's Tanagra dress. The dress was inspired by the 4th century BC terracotta figurines which were found towards the end of the 19th century in the Greek town of Tanagra. These figurines represented fashionable women or girls, not goddesses, elegantly draped in thin himation, which is the iconic wrap very common in classic Greece. Genoni's Tanagra dress was very versatile. You could drape it in different ways, and at the same time It was extremely revolutionary because it shaped a silhouette freed from the slavery of the corset and consequently more fluid and natural. Rosa wore the Tanagra dress when she spoke at the first Italian National Congress of Women in Rome in 1908. The second pioneer is Mariano Fortuny, who worked in Venice. Starting in the mid-19th century, Venice was a crossroad for cosmopolitan writers, musicians, and artists, such as Harry James, Richard Wagner, John Ruskin, and Sergei Diaghilev. It was indeed the perfect place for the Spanish-born and French-educated Mariano Fortuny, who established his Atelier d'Impression, the fabric screen printing workshop, in the wondrous salons of Palazzo Pesaro degli Orfei in 1889. Born in an artistic and cultivated family, Fortuny was a painter, a light and textile designer, and a fashion genius. In few words, he represented the Southern European counterpart of the Vienna Secession members, whose mission was the unification of all art forms: design, applied arts, architecture, painting, and fashion. While he was still in Paris, Fortuny met Henriette Negrin, who became his muse, PR, and visionary right arm. It was Henriette who, around 1907, would print the Knossos scarves, inspired by the ancient decorative motifs discovered in the Palace of Knossos on the Greek island of Crete in the early 20th century. Henriette was also responsible for the design of the Delphos gown, launched in 1909. The name comes from the bronze statue of the charioteer of Delphi, found in the Temple of Apollo in Delphi in 1896. The distinctive fine pleats, whose process remains a well-kept secret even today, were plausibly inspired by the early century Greek young female statues called chorei, young girls, which in the 19th century were largely reproduced in prints and illustrations that Fortuny collected. The silk that Fortuny and Negrin used for their Delphos gowns were dipped multiple times in dyed bath, enriching the colors of the fabric, which fluctuatingly slightly varied according to light and movement. The edges of the Delphos were embellished with string of small Venetian beads that served both as an ornament and to weigh the dress down, giving its distinctive drape. Seduced by Fortuny's innovative pleated dresses and printed shawls, his clientele included the dancers Ida Rubinstein and Isadora Duncan, the actresses Eleonora Duse and Sarah Bernhardt, the flamboyant Marchesa Casati, and the Queen Marie of Romania. And even Marcel Proust, in his The Search of the Lost Time, wrote that Madame de Gramont, the epitome of aristocratic elegance, owned heaps of Fortuny's gowns. The paintings of Botticelli, Titian, and Carpaccio provided inspiration for the shapes, colors, and motifs, which Fortuny then developed in the luxurious velvet jackets, overcoat, and mantles. Although simple in design, the dyes and pigments he created in his laboratory gave the velvets a mysterious, iridescent, transparent quality which turned them into wearable works of art. There are few fashion designers from the early decades of the 20th century whose creation could be worn today without resembling a fancy dress. And Fortuny is definitely one of the few. And now let's meet Maria Monaci Gallenga, who was active in Rome during the first 3 decades of the last century. Rome, the capital of Italy and the Eternal City, was more dependent on Paris as a fashion source. Among the most renowned dressmakers were Sorelle Botti, who opened their salon in 1911 and traveled to Paris to purchase patterns to reproduce for high society ladies. However, Maria Monaci Gallenga's approach to fashion was totally free from Paris trends, and based on a mix of historical and artistic influences. She looks, for instance, back to the ancient Mediterranean civilization and the Italian Renaissance as sources of inspiration. Like Fortuny, Gallenga also experimented with printing techniques. She was awarded the Grand Prix at the 1925 Decorative Arts Expo Fair in Paris. And here is our last pioneer, Ernesto Michaelis, known as Thayaht. Thayaht worked in Florence as an artist, jeweler, and designer, and he's one of the creative talents strongly associated with the Futurism. Futurism was an avant-garde movement which flourished in Italy in the first decades of the 20th century. It glorified speed and technology and also had an idiosyncratic impact on fashion with asymmetrical silhouettes and bold colors combination. Florence, where Thayaht operated, was strongly linked to Futurism. The literary magazine La Cerba, for instance, closely connected with the movement, was founded in 1913 in Florence. And in Piazza della Repubblica, the recently closed Café Giubbe Rosse, Red Coats, saw the Futurists blossom. In this milieu, Thayaht quickly emerged as the darling of the local aristocracy thanks to his geometric silhouettes. In 1919, he launched La Tuta, the overalls, a masterpiece of practicality and the early anticipation of the modern zero-waste concept. Thayaht was also the first Italian designer to collaborate with a French couturier. As a consultant for Madeleine Vionnet from 1918 to 1925, he created the Maison's logo and designed graphic pattern textile. However, Genoni, Fortuny, Gallenga, and Thayaht were isolated cases as in Paris fashion continued to rule in Italy. Even during the fascism, and despite the Mussolini law which banned everything that came from foreign country, many Italian ateliers continued to reproduce Paris outfits. It all changed in the early 50s, but this is something that you already know. Are you puzzled? Well, you better go back and check the letter W. Thanks for listening. And keep in mind what the legendary costume designer Thayaht said. Fashion is a language. Some know it, some learn it like an instinct. Goodbye.